Hola, yo soy Katie Gordon y soy una detective con la policía de Oklahoma City. For those of you still learning in Spanish class, I'm a detective with the Oklahoma City Police Department. I've worked for the police department for about 8 years now. I spent my first 7 years in patrol, just responding to 911 calls, doing traffic stops, just everything that a police officer on the street does. And then for the last about 6 or 7 months, I've entered a new role as a detective. So I'm currently assigned to the domestic violence unit for the Oklahoma City Police Department. Talking to you today because I actually use Spanish quite a bit in my job. I grew up in Stroud, Oklahoma, which is just a small town. I didn't have any background in Spanish. Everything started for me whenever I just took my foreign language classes in high school. I had a really good Spanish teacher. It kind of spurred a love of the language on for me. And so as I went on through the rest of high school and then college too, I just kept taking Spanish classes. So I really enjoyed the language. I appreciated the fact that I could communicate with all kinds of different people. It opened up opportunities for study abroad and even some interest in studying other foreign languages too. But most of what I learned was just strictly from school. So I learned a lot. I was a lot better at reading and writing than I was at speaking and understanding, which I'm sure some of you can relate to. But anyway, after I graduated college, I had a few other jobs, and then I decided just on a whim to join the police department. So that's been an adventure in itself. But in addition to just being kind of an interesting and challenging career path for someone like me, just being a smaller female and someone who never expected to be a police officer, my Spanish background really came in handy. So one of the most obvious incentives there is I'm actually on the bilingual unit. You don't have to be a native speaker or native speaker level to achieve that, but I did have to take a test over the phone that's like an interview style, and I scored a 6 out of 10 on that scale, and to be on our bilingual unit, you only had to score a 4. So being level 6 meant that I could use it on the streets, I could translate, I could talk to victims and I could interview them, I could talk to a witness. The only thing I couldn't do at a 6 is interview a suspect formally for an interrogation. And in order to do that, you do have to be an 8. Now, I did something else kind of strange while I was working for the police department. At one point, I applied for a special exception and leave of absence, and I knew that my Spanish mostly was from the books, and I had a harder time in conversation and listening, like I said. So I applied for that leave of absence to go live in Mexico City for 6 months. That definitely took my Spanish to another level. It did help my grammar some, but it helped my speaking, comprehension, and definitely my understanding. So that kind of put the two pieces together. In order to pass the test and be able to be a certified bilingual unit member, all I needed was to know the grammar from the books, essentially. But to really use that skill on the streets, I needed that practice in another culture, and I needed that practice just with conversation and having everything when it's being spoken at a normal speed is like a whole other level. So that kind of put the pieces together for me to really have that be something I use almost on a daily basis at work. So while I was out on patrol, obviously if a call came out and someone calling 911 was a Spanish speaker and had limited English proficiency, I could respond to that scene, I could figure out what was going on, some of the relevant information you needed immediately. I could actually get from that person, what happened, did we have a suspect we needed to identify, try to look for in the moment, were the suspect still in the room or in the area. And even whenever someone calls 911, if they have to have someone translate, there's a time gap before they get on the language line, they find the right language, and then it's kind of a game of telephone back and forth. I could eliminate that gap and get things done a little bit more quickly that way. Now that I've switched and I am a detective, I have a little bit different role. So my role right now in the department is not the immediate response on the street after someone calls 911. I do follow-up investigations and I assist with filing charges on our different cases now, and in particular in domestic violence. So unfortunately that's a big problem worldwide, honestly, and it affects every community. but we have a big Hispanic population in Oklahoma City. So each time we have a case that has a native Spanish speaker, usually it gets assigned to me. I help other detectives almost on a daily basis, interviewing other victims, witnesses, translating different text messages and things sent back and forth. And pretty much if someone calls the office just speaking in Spanish immediately, our poor secretary, we'll put her I think semester-long Spanish skills to work and try to understand at least a name for me, but then she just puts them on hold and gets them sent over to me. So I get phone calls every day and thinking, I don't have a case under this number, but as soon as I answer it, I just have a very confused Spanish speaker on the other end, and I have to figure out what they need and help get them to the right person to the right place. So that's how Spanish helps me in my work. Everything I've done in law enforcement, because I've had a few other different stints working for other agencies, like the OSBI at one point. Spanish has always been something helpful. It's been something that people have encouraged me to do if I wanted to have agent positions, if I wanted to do any other kind of detective work like homicide. From every single angle, Spanish has been something that's an asset, and the more I've learned it, it's been useful in my job, but it's also encouraged me to get a deeper understanding, because the higher you go on that proficiency level too, the more useful you are at your job, the more effective you are, and the more you can build good relationships with people in that community too. I think that's it.
And do you have any recommendations for students that are studying Spanish?
Yeah, absolutely. So definitely stick with it, because the grammar side is important. Like I said, the test I had to take to get certified to be on the bilingual unit, it is a conversation style interview, but they do pay close attention to the grammar, and the interview gets progressively harder grammatically depending on how well you do. So they do pay attention to whether you can speak not only conversational Spanish, but if you can speak it correctly and properly and use the correct tense for certain things, because that becomes important when you're talking to people about any kind of crime that's occurred. The other thing too is, in addition to that, do something to step outside your comfort zone and grow your conversation skills, because that's the other half of the coin. Even when you can speak something fairly well in a controlled environment where you know the vocabulary, it's a different ballgame when someone just comes up to you and starts talking about something else, and you have to use context clues, and you have to see it as a conversation and not just an equation or formula. So I always encourage people, do Duolingo or any other app that helps you out with that. Listen to things like, if you can find a podcast you like, or even like a children's show in Spanish, that will help you get some listening skills. And more than anything, make a friend. Make a friend who speaks Spanish and learn some of the different ways that they phrase things. The other thing too, if you have the time, opportunity, travel abroad. Do anything you can to study abroad, because that's a great environment that's kind of scripted for you. But even if you don't have a program you want to go through, I mean, find an opportunity to volunteer, to actually live in another culture, and to just get that whole experience with being immersed. That's the biggest way to grow. It takes a lot of energy, and it can get really frustrating because you take for granted how easy it is to speak in your native language and just be understood, and to put forth very little energy and you can still hear and understand things. When you have to think about it and try just to listen, it's a different experience, but it's one of the only things that will really make you proficient, and it's always worth the struggle that it is.